Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lucy Rica. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on the Legal Profession here at the Law School on the second floor in the Crown Building, if you ever want to stop by and chat. We are very pleased, along with the International Law Society and the International Law Journal, to welcome Gareth Ash, who is not a lawyer. He is the CIO, Chief Intelligence Officer? Chief Information Officer. Of Overy in the UK, and he is here for the cybersecurity conference and graciously offered to come and give a chat to us. Gareth started his career in systems and business analysis at BUPA, a UK medical insurer, and then moved on to computer programming and project management. In the mid-90s, he joined the financial services organization Prudential PLC and spent 9 years there, developing a variety of initiatives and specializing in outsourcing and acquisitions. He joined Allen & Overy in December 2003, 10 years ago, and before becoming CIO, was global head of operations responsible for the maintenance of all systems, infrastructure, procurement, disaster recovery and security. And once you start working at a law firm, you're going to realize just how important those jobs are. As CIO, Gareth is responsible for all aspects of technology at the firm, including looking at future market for technology in the legal industry and how that could benefit the firm. He sits on the Partner Innovation Panel, the Risk Management Committee, and is a member of the Global Management Team. So please welcome Gareth Ash. Gareth, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm switched on. So what I was going to talk about today for about 40 odd minutes or so was a little bit about the UK market. And when I'm talking about the UK market, that includes international law firms outside of the US that tend to be headquartered in the UK. And also when I talk about the UK, I mean England and Wales, because in terms of a regulatory framework, Northern Ireland and Scotland, if you know your geography, have a different framework to England and Wales. Now, before I start, does anyone know who Allen & Overy is before you Googled me before coming along? Okay, so not too bad. So what I thought I'd do to start with is just very quick, what is Allen & Overy? Although started off as a UK firm, and one of our first clients in 1936 was Edward VIII when we handled the abdication. But now, as you see, we're in over 40 offices around the world, and actually, majority of the firm is located outside of the UK. And then there's the sort of makeup of our practices. So very sort of significant in the financial institutions and banking. And as you can see, in comparison to a US law firm, our litigation is fairly small, but we have great ambitions to grow that area. So most of our major clients are the sort of significant financial institutions around the world. So that's all I was going to say on A&O in terms of the background. Now, before I move on, here's a pop quiz that I'm hoping everyone will know. Who said this? Does anyone know? Okay, it was Bill Gates. And I like this quote, especially in the context of the legal industry, because it doesn't tend to move that fast. Not a lot happens in 2 years, although everyone predicts a lot will. But actually, when you look back over 10 years, and as Lucy said, I've been at Allen & Overy for 10 years, it's changed incredibly. So I think this quote will frame it quite nicely, hopefully. Now, I'm not actually going to ask you who said that, because it'd be a trick question, because it was me. I tweeted it a little while back, because there is a lot written about the death of big law and traditional law, and it's all going to end. And I think it is a little bit of an exaggeration. Law is quite a resilient industry. However, I do believe that it is going through a significant transformation, and that transformation has started a few years ago. So, next few slides, I wanted to just provide some sort of context before I start talking about the UK. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, because a lot of people more qualified than me have talked about the credit crunch and the economic downturn. But the significance of that event was actually, this was the trigger to the transformation itself. This was when things started to change especially as the sort of balance of power between the law firm and the client quite clearly moved towards the client, who, of course, started demanding a lot more in difficult economic situations. And if you look at these figures, which are sort of before and after that sort of event, it looks pretty stark, and you think, well, that's pretty grim. But in actual fact, the data hides a bit more of a reality of what's happening at the moment, because in actual fact, what we're seeing, especially over the numbers in 2012 and 13, that we're returning to a more normal state of the sort of 15 years before that bonanza period, and it really was a bonanza period. So in actual fact, we're sort of getting back to the situation as it was from the sort of 90s to the early 2000s. But there is one fundamental difference, and that is the legal market is actually changed. And it's that transformation and that change that I'm going to talk a little bit about. I mean, if we look at the actual sort of global trends that are happening, put down there, globalization is irreversible. You know, that is the sort of economic, cultural, and social activities transcending borders and boundaries is not going to go back. The sort of genie of that bottle is out. And it may have some hiccups. We have things like the sort of Arab Spring uprisings. Even the fallout over who's spying on who at the moment causes some frostiness, as we've seen in terms of the Germans in their attitude to America at the moment. But these are just hiccups and blips. Because that globalization is also being driven by demographics. We've added 1 billion people in the last 12 years to the population and 2 billion since 1987. And that is creating rising middle class that, regardless of sort of culture and background, have the same aspirations of all of us. And of course, the other aspect that's driving globalization is the rise of the emerging markets, the growth markets that are predicted in the next 5 years, their GDP will grow by 53%. And that actual fact, the biggest trade corridor will be advanced Asia to emerging Asia by 2030, and that will account for over 60% of all exports. So, as you can imagine, our clients are pouring into these markets, and where clients go, international law firms follow. And then technology. I'm not going to say much when I'm standing in Silicon Valley about the significance of technology, the game changer and the enabler it can be. And so far, it has transformed many industries. And I think only a legal ostrich would bury their head in the sand and say it's not going to change the legal market in the future. And then there's these business drivers. Since that economic downturn, client demand is changing. They want more certainty over fees. They want a more efficient law firm. They want a law firm that's proactive to the challenges they face. And they want more investment in relationships and training. And of course, this is all forcing a disaggregation of the legal process, a breaking up of that process into its component parts and elements, which means it can now be costed separately and actually done by different people. And of course, that means new models to deal with these new parts of the process, an attraction of new entrants who think there's money to be made, and of course, new methods being deployed into the sort of legal industry. But most significantly of all, I put down there is it's a buyer's market, and a buyer's market means competition, which we'll soon see. So what about the global legal market size itself? It's pretty significant, and the squeeze on the demand of legal services we saw post-credit crunch is actually already loosening, and you can see the sort of growth forecast predicted there. And being driven out of litigation, we see in the tech world IP and patents. Also, clients are facing increasing regulatory regimes, having to look at their compliance, but also out of opportunity. All those emerging markets mean there's trade to be done, and there's also rules of law to be written. So the question isn't volume, the question is who's actually going to be doing the work in the future. And so we sort of come then back towards the big law firms and what's happening. And so this transformation is triggered. What we're seeing is effectively the era of the mega merger. Norton Rose Fulbright has done 5 mergers in 3 years. Then you've got just the news the other day of Orphans looking to merge with Pillsbury. And you've got Sonnershines of Chicago, who merged with Dentons of the UK, who've now merged with Salons of France. But perhaps the most interesting merger of all was Kingwood of China, merging with Mallisons of Australia, who have now merged with S.J. Berwin of the UK. And that is the first, I think, major international law firm that is not centered around the US or the UK. So quite interesting times. And then as we draw back towards, if you like, the UK and the international market, actually one of the biggest challenges facing sort of firms in that arena is actually the rise of the US, who have actually, their firms have traditionally focused on their domestic market, not surprising as over 50% of legal spend is here in America, and obviously with a thriving litigation sector as well. And as you can see, they've been very active in pursuing a sort of globalization strategy, and they have very attractive remuneration models where they're able to take on lateral hires from other firms, and we're seeing that in London at the moment. They are hiring quite vociferously, the US firms. So quite a challenge for the non-US firms. So that's pretty much the context and the sort of background, and I must say, if you've got any questions or you don't understand my English, please let me know. So let's now sort of narrow right down into the UK and the Legal Services Act. This is quite interesting because many bar associations around the world are keeping an eye on what's happening in the UK at the moment. And what happened back in July 2003 is an investment banker called David Clementi was asked to do an independent review on the regulatory framework for the delivery of legal services in England and Wales. And as I say, at the moment, I will transpose those terms England and Wales and the UK. And its purpose was to widen access to justice for the consumer and the public at large. And that's a very important point to remember. And what that set out to do through a regulatory framework was to provide one that was competitive, innovative, and would provide an efficient and effective independent legal sector within the UK. And that framework should be comprehensive, accountable, but it should be transparent and flexible and not be weighed down by any unnecessary restrictions or burdens. And it was quickly nicknamed Tesco Law. Now, Tesco's is a very large supermarket chain, so I put in brackets there, read Walmart. And the reason it was nicknamed Tesco Law was because the intention of the Act was to make purchasing legal services as easy as buying your groceries. And that's why it was nicknamed Tesco Law, and it's sort of stuck ever since. Funny enough, Tesco's is a large supermarket chain and a bank and all these other things now, but doesn't seem to have much interest in delivering legal services yet. So, the Act came into effect in 2011, and it has two main provisions. The creation of an Uber regulator, the Legal Services Board, and then the most exciting thing of all, alternative business structures, which I will come on to. So what about the Legal Services Board itself? So this is the super regulator that regulates all the frontline regulatory bodies who are authorized to regulate the delivery of legal services within the UK. And a lawyer, in inverted commas, is a member of one of the 8 branches of the profession that you see there. And so I guess in sort of more general sense, solicitors you would call attorneys, for instance. And it is only a lawyer of one of those professions who is allowed to undertake the reserved legal activities that I've listed at the bottom of the table. So what that means is, to perform those activities, you must be a lawyer as defined in the profession, and that means you are regulated and authorized under the Legal Services Act. Now, the interesting thing you may or may not notice is, for instance, what does that mean for general advice, employment advice, writing wills, transactional corporate advice? Well, none of that is a reserved legal activity, which means you don't need to be a lawyer, and it means you don't need to be regulated. So you can see an awful lot of, if you like, legal work can be actually done outside of the regulatory framework. So what about alternative business structures? As I said, this was the really interesting bit, because this is the mechanism by which access to law would be widened to the consumer and the public. And what it was going to do to achieve that, or I should say has done to achieve that, is change the traditional owner-manager model of a law firm and attract external investment capital into the business of law for the first time. And therefore, it would create competition and innovation, which would lower cost. It would allow law firms to take on capital so that they could modernize, reorganize, and expand. And it would allow law firms to partner with real estate agents, insurers, and accountants to provide a one-stop shop on the high street. And that's what an alternative business structure is, which the official name is a licensed body. Now, they started taking applications for licenses in January 2011 and started issuing licenses in March 2013. And so far, over 200 have been granted. Now, remember, this was all about widening access to justice for the consumer. However, sometimes when you have these acts, the law of unintended consequences can kick in, and that's what I'm sort of going to focus on the next slide. And I've got some examples here. So the first is the co-op. Actually, they may have made the American press this week because they have a bank also which has hit some trouble, and some US hedge funds have stepped in to sort of help out. But the co-op is mainly known as a supermarket chain. It's actually a mutual organization, so it's owned by its members. It also is one of the biggest provider of funeral services in the UK and sells insurance and travel as well. And they have applied and got an ABS, and they have the ambition of becoming the largest provider of legal services in the UK by 2022. Then there's Slater and Gordon. I don't know if anyone knows who they are, but they're an Australian law firm who were the first ever to float in 2007. They're a personal injury firm, and in 2012 they bought the UK personal injury firm Russell Jones, and in 2013 they bought another personal injury firm in the UK, Fenton's. And that has created Slater and Gordon UK, and that's an example of the first ever foreign ABS. Again, I can't believe that was the intention of the Legal Services Act when it started. Then we come on to Brilliant Law. Their sort of strapline is the first ever pure breed startup law firm. And they were created by non-lawyers. And the interesting thing about them is their major investor is somebody called Andrew Burt Black, who happens to be the owner, or I should say the person who created Betfair. I don't know if you've ever heard of Betfair, but it is the world's first and largest online betting exchange, which completely disrupted the gaming market. And so you can imagine they're pretty serious about what they plan to do in the legal sector. And they very much provide fixed fee services to small, medium enterprises, and have a strong philosophy in promoting their services through a digital footprint. Then there's Irwin Mitchell. This one caused quite a few headlines simply because they're a top 20 UK law firm who specialise in litigation. And they very early on applied for an ABS because they wanted access or potential access to funds to allow them to expand. Wynn Solicitors, they're now 60% owned by two private equity firms, which has propelled them into the 123rd position in the top 200 of UK law firms. And the interesting thing about this is it took over a year to process their application, simply because the Legal Services Act was not really meant for private equity. And then we come on to Keystone Law. They pitch themselves as an alternative to the traditional law firm. They're what you call a dispersed law firm. They don't have big offices all around the country. They tend to operate either at home or on the client's site. They have central sort of support functions. And they very much recruit from the top city firms in terms of their senior associates and partners, and they have a full service offering. And they're now looking at joint ventures in Israel, Ireland, and Australia. And then British Telecoms, one of the sort of largest telecommunication companies in the world, created BT Law. And that was to process motor claims, because they had a large legal department who were actually working on their own fleet of vehicles and realized they could actually launch themselves as an APS and sell those services on to other people who have fleets of vehicles. And interestingly enough, BT bought a company called Ticket, and they're a provider of consultancy and software solutions within the legal industry, and one of their most well-known products is Carpe Diem, which is a time entry system that many large law firms such as Allen Overy uses. At the moment, I haven't seen anything about the connection between that and BT Law itself, but it just goes to show perhaps where the thinking in BT is going. And then as a final example, the insurance company. Admiral is a large UK insurance provider, and they've teamed up and have an ABS with a personal injury law firm because they didn't want to start a law firm from scratch to provide services to their policyholders. So what you can see there is the sort of some examples of perhaps of the law of unintended consequences. And there have been a few stumbles. One firm had its license revoked for suspected dishonesty and not following accountancy rules and regulations. But KPMG and Ernst & Young are both interested in potentially taking out ABSs within the UK market. So this is something that's being taken quite seriously by a lot of different types of organisation. But another thing that the Legal Services Act has done is created, if you like, a spirit of freedom, a spirit of liberalism, so that others have thought there are opportunities, and this is best epitomised by Riverview Law. And Riverview Law are a little bit like the firm I just mentioned, Keystone Law. They're very much selling themselves as an alternative to the traditional law firm. And their sort of proposal, if you like, or their pitch, is that they work on a fixed fee basis. You have an annual contract. They have a portal page to allow members and clients to go in and access tools that they make available. And they also allow you to download lots of free content. They have a membership scheme to maintain and deepen relationships. And they also have a sort of no quibble, try before you buy refund policy if you don't like the service. And they're looking at a strategic alliance with another UK firm called DMH Stallard. But here's the most interesting thing about Riverview Law. One of their majority investors is DLA Piper, which by fee income is the largest law firm in the world. So again, interesting how many different types of organizations are getting interested in this sort of freedom of the UK market. And Riverview Law also have Riverview Chambers, which provides access to the courts in the UK for both domestic and international clients, and they have over 40 barristers signed up into Riverview Chambers. It's all on a fixed fee basis, and a lot of those are what we call Queen's Counsel or silks. They're like the sort of the cream of the barristers. So, what are the traditional law firms doing around this space? Well, here you've got a list of 15 of not only the sort of largest UK law firms, but some of the largest law firms in the world. And each one of those, in the last few years, has opened, for instance, a legal service centre to provide a low-cost option to clients who perhaps don't want to use legal process outsourcers. Or have opened a shared service centre to consolidate their support functions into a nearshore or offshore location so that they can look at driving down cost and improving efficiency. And in some cases, like my own firm, we've done both. And so what I wanted to do in the next slide was actually look at some more specific examples of what's happening. And again, I do stress, if I'm saying words or terminology that you're not familiar with, or you've got any questions, please say so. So what's happening in the sort of legal innovation space itself? Well, Clifford Chance, a major global law firm, they have their business transformation team. And they've been using Six Sigma techniques to actually analyze all the steps in the process of their transactions with a view of improving them or simplifying them. And I think they've done over 40 so far, and they've got 40 more in the pipeline. And they also have 18% of their non-secretarial support staff based out of India. Then there's Adishal Goddard. They're doing something similar with their transaction services team, where they've mapped out 50-odd processes, and they're very much focusing on the resourcing side, looking at what resources need to do what parts of the process. And within the transactional services team, they will take on the more administrative or process-driven elements to free up the actual fee earner to do more challenging work. And their ambition is to have 10% of their work done like this by 2015. And then Linklaters, another major international law firm, they have their strategy and business transformation team, which is their center of excellence for business optimization, legal project management, and change. And then we come on to a space that's actually gaining quite some momentum in the UK, which is alternative resourcing. This is looking at perhaps the old days of being able to staff for the peaks of work, which is what traditionally happened because law tended to grow every year, and to look how you can have a more flexible resourcing model, not just for yourself within your own law firm, but actually to sell that into the clients. And what Bowen, Leighton & Paisner did back in 2008, they were the first, they launched Lawyers on Demand, effectively a pool of contract lawyers which were on a fixed fee secondment basis into clients, for instance, and they have over 120 now lawyers operating like this, and last year it pulled in, I think, something like £9 million worth of revenue. And then there's Eversheds. They have what they call their Agile brand, and they do something similar to Lawyers on Demand. They're providing contract lawyers to cover maternity, secondments, gaps in headcount. And again, that's work remotely or on site, and you can pay daily on a weekly basis. And Freshfield's done something similar with their alumni. They're using their alumni as a sort of contract resource. And then we come on to an area which is quite interesting. I'll say why it's interesting in a moment, but it's some of the new services you're seeing. And the first one, again, it's Bowen, Leighton & Paisner. In 2010, they sort of launched their managed legal services. And effectively, what happened was Thames Water, a utility company in the UK, effectively outsourced a majority of their in-house legal work to managed legal services. And although the GC didn't go across, about 14 or 15 lawyers did. And I think that was on a sort of £5 million a year deal, which meant work that was previously done by panels from lots of law firms was now going to be done by Bowen, Leighton & Paisner. And the reason this is interesting is, my observation from working in other industries is, people often outsource their non-core functions, but that hasn't really happened in law at all. And this is one of the only examples I know of, and it still seems to be an untapped potential that no one is looking at that seriously. Because in the next example, it's slightly different. Balfour Beatty is a large construction and infrastructure firm, and it looked at its external legal spend and effectively split it into two bits. The sort of BAU, recurrent, low-risk pot, and then into the sort of business critical and complex pot. And what it said for the BAU work is they issued a tender, and Pinsent Masons won that tender. Actually, they beat managed legal services to that as well. So this is almost going back to a little bit of the retainer model of the old days for the sort of less complex work. They still maintain their panel, and of course Pinsent sits on the panel for the more complex stuff as well. But that's quite an interesting space because it's not something where I've seen a lot of movement compared to perhaps what happens in some of the other industries with non-core functions. And then I wasn't going to talk a lot about legal processing outsourcing, and I don't know if that term is familiar to everybody. These are sort of organizations that have started to do, or certainly do, the more high volume, low risk work, due diligence and document review. The only reason I mention it here, Integrium, which is one of the bigger ones in the world, back in 2010, Cameron McKenna effectively outsourced all their support functions, just about all of it, to Integrium. And there has been a few stumbles along the way. But I mention it because it was significant, because it was a piece of news that hit the headlines and made a lot of law firms sit up and think, well, what are we doing in this space? And it was a little bit of the trigger that caused a bit of momentum. So that's sort of looking at the legal business sort of innovation, what's going on. I'm now going to sort of talk a little bit around the technology side. And although I'm an IT person, I think I have to be honest and say this is lagging behind some of the more legal business innovation that you're seeing. But we'll go through some of it anyway. So I've split sort of some of the sort of technologies, if you like, into two groups. Those that are business improving, in other words, they're just refining what's already out there, and those that are disruptive, those that potentially can come into the market and really impact the traditional way of delivering legal services. And this is far from an exhaustive list. I'm not claiming that at all, but I think it captures the essence of most areas that are being done. Now, I wasn't going to talk too much about the business improving side because I think most of that sort of speaks for itself, collaboration platforms and workflow systems. I was more going to focus on the business disruption side, but I'm happy to take questions later on the business improving as well. So online client services. This is not actually about using new technology. This is actually about using existing technology to deliver services in a different way to that traditional model. And this is probably one area where I will refer to Alan and Overy because we've actually been in this space for about 10 years, and I can't take any credit for it because it's not within mainstream IT. It's a colleague of mine called Marc-Henri Chimay, who runs our e-business division. And effectively what Marc-Henri does is he takes complex areas of the law, say shareholder disclosure rules, and he packages the myriad of rules and regulations across all the jurisdictions into color-coded guides that actually clients can purchase for a subscription fee on our online portal. And it's very popular and it's very profitable as well. And it's a good example of just showing how the law could be delivered in a different way. It doesn't need magical new technologies. Then there's document automation. This is really interesting as well because you would have thought this was the one technology which has been out a long time but never really caught on. You think, well, the product that a lawyer does is a document, surely if I can automate that. And I guess I know where they're coming from because when I do presentations, I tend to go to a presentation that looks pretty similar, do a save as, and then rearrange things and change the date and things like that. And obviously lawyers are the same when they're doing work internally. Of course, it's got lots of potential if you're talking about trainees, and you want to also make sure there's some consistency in what people are doing. But it's interesting that it hasn't quite taken off as you'd expect. However, you're now seeing that change because it's being used to deliver online services to customers. So if you're actually able, for instance, in a very simple example, have somebody go online, fill out the questions to a will, and create a will out of the system, that's of a great benefit. And that's where I see the real power of it. It's probably less internal, but more delivering services externally. And then we come on to a very interesting part, which is around search. I would say search has never been done that well in a law firm, and I'm trying to work out why. I don't know if it's money. I don't know if it's size and scale. Or is it just that the fact that we're working in words and the nuances of words and probability algorithms perhaps don't quite render the results that you need? However, now as we start to see conceptual and semantic search coming in, where we're starting to be able to deal with that nuances, you're seeing real opportunities to start doing basic due diligence and document review through a machine rather than having hundreds of junior lawyers have to pore through documents. And then online dispute resolution, I'll probably use an example that you may have heard of already. Has everyone heard of CyberSettle? Is everyone familiar with that? So this is an online dispute resolution platform that has a blind bidding system so that two parties can actually resolve a dispute with no involvement of lawyers whatsoever. And it's already processed $2 billion worth of payouts. And I guess the main thing here is taking a very imaginative and innovative perspective on the business of law and coming up with a solution that parties are willing to buy into. And then finally, perhaps the ultimate, artificial intelligence to provide advice and guidance to lawyers, and perhaps one day's replace lawyers in certain aspects of the work that they do. So the concept of a legal avatar, the concept of being able to sort of go online, post your questions in, and get some serious legal advice back from an artificial intelligence system. And again, if people have never seen the sort of Watson Jeopardy video on YouTube, it's worth watching because you'll see a computer beat humans at Jeopardy. And interestingly enough, talking to IBM recently, their software, their hardware or their technology within the Deep Blue computer that beat Garry Kasparov at chess was in the PlayStation 3 4 or 5 years later. So what they're doing in sort of, if you like, stunts like the Jeopardy, it's quite easy to see how that computing power could be put to quite useful ventures in the legal sector. So that was a sort of just around some of the categories. Just to focus in on a few specifics, of which some of you may know these because they've come out of Silicon Valley. But these are ones that I have some knowledge of. I have a sort of longer list. Some of those things have come across my desk and are not in the public domain, so I didn't feel I could really put them up on a slide. And if we start off, I'm not going to go through every single one, but HiQ Collaborate, that's actually based in the UK. It is used by a lot of international law firms, European law firms. And basically, that is a secure file sharing platform. It has built-in enterprise social collaboration. It has productivity tool sets and knowledge sharing capabilities. And we're starting to see that used more and more in working with clients against the sort of traditional way of perhaps running a transaction. And then I put document automation in there. We use Contract Express. And for our 300-page credit agreements for the banks, it is extremely useful. But if you haven't seen it, Exari is a great example of what I was talking about using document automation in the online context. I actually started working my way through a professional services agreement, and it was incredibly simple. I knew precisely where I was in the sort of clauses, and the questions had options such as, did I want to make this clause sort of strong for me, strong for the other side, or sort of sit on the fence a little bit. And it was quite impressive. And then some people say, oh, that's all very well and good for a professional services agreement or that sort of consumer stuff. But actually, Exari is the master agreements, and they're not potentially simplistic documents at all. And then a couple of niche ones. I won't say too much about Ravel because I'm about to meet them after this presentation, so I'll probably know a lot more after then. But Lex Machina is an interesting one. This is a sort of an outcome forecasting type platform. And it's interesting because we started to think about that internally as well. Some litigators have got some good ideas around mathematical models to start trying to forecast the outcome of cases and potentially using gaming theory as well to try and predict what the other side might do. So this is why I've picked this one because it's quite close to some of the stuff we're thinking about in our firm. But Lex Machina basically does deep mining on litigation data and then gives you sort of insights into the courts, the lawyers, the patents, all sorts of information to sort of allow you to sort of hopefully predict where your case might go.
Came out of Stanford.
Yes. Must be good. And then around the document support, these are more sort of minor tools that tend to support the lawyer in understanding the use or misuse of defined terms, recognize duplications, and tend to be sort of plugins into Word itself. And then in the middle category, the sort of practice in a box, I don't know a lot about that personally because this is really about access to incredible tools if you're starting up a law firm or you've got a small law firm. So effectively, you're buying a cloud-based service which will deliver you a finance system, a document management system, a time recording system, a task scheduling system, many things that firms like ours sort of spend lots of money having to build ourselves. And it's quite impressive, you know, especially if you're a small or medium-sized firm. And then sort of last and certainly not least, perhaps the area that has been the most ignored for the longest period of time, but where we're now starting to see some movement, and that's document drafting itself. And I might have to explain, do I have to explain the expression, the coalface? So the coalface is obviously where the work gets done. So this is where a lawyer really does their job. So it's quite surprising that for so long, not a lot has been done in this arena. But now it is starting to change. And Kayak, again, you may have heard of, because again, that's from around the Silicon Valley area, I believe.
Yeah, it's KM Systems.
Yeah. And that provides you, first of all, it can provide you a first draft. It can do benchmarking and comparing to a standard. And it can have templates and clause libraries as well. And it's quite impressive. And we're hoping to do a sort of trial with Kayak themselves, or KM Systems, sorry, in the near future with our corporate department. And then I'm going to talk about the one below ICE, not necessarily to tell you precisely what it does, but more because it highlights two interesting points. So ICE is actually from an Australian startup called TKBT. I did tell them, why did you choose that name? But that's what they went for. And Alan Overy itself is doing some modest investment in this because it was something I saw over 2 years ago. And this is my first point. Over 2 years ago when I saw it, and I managed to get some interest in our firm to sort of put some money behind it, I thought I had all the time in the world. If you looked for legal technology, I mean, really good, innovative, disruptive legal technology, it's pretty difficult to find 2 years ago. And then about a year ago, all these things to me, and I don't sit in Silicon Valley, so I'm probably a little bit further away from the communication line, seemed to burst onto the scenes. All of a sudden there was Kayak, and there was Ravel, and there was Zoom Law, and there were all these other things going on. So that was the first thing when I suddenly realized, wow, you know, this is not, we don't have all the time in the world if we're going to do something with this. And what this does, by the way, is it's looking at drafting from the ground up. So basically it doesn't use Word at all. It uses an object-oriented environment to provide advanced features and functions around the entire drafting process. So it's specifically made with lawyers in mind, as opposed to Word, which is a generic word processing application. And it doesn't use any applications or styles either, so you can forget all that. The thing that is the bane of all lawyers and causes instability in documents around applying templates to their contracts. And behind it will also be a database that will start to record information, not just at subclause level, but at word level as well, providing sort of advanced search, analysis, and retrieval capabilities. So I wouldn't call it the codification of knowledge, but maybe the semi-codification of knowledge, making it much easier for you to actually retrieve information, because as I said, in a law firm, you're dealing with knowledge as your industry, but actually finding that information subsequently and using it in a meaningful way has been a challenge, certainly for me and most of my colleagues in other law firms as well. But as I said, I'm not, you know, whether this works or takes off, I don't know. We're just investing in a startup to see if it takes us somewhere. But the second important point is the founder and director of this firm is a senior associate in a law firm who happened to do law and software engineering at university. And to me, that is the sort of golden combination. Being able to work with somebody who sort of gets the legal side and gets the technology side, bringing that together is really where the magic happens. Because traditionally lawyers are very focused on the legal side, perhaps not thinking on the tech, and people like myself aren't lawyers, so perhaps I don't get what the challenges for them are. But to start working with somebody who gets both sides of the equation is very powerful. And in fact, many of those things I showed on the previous slide do have a lawyer behind them, and that's the difference with some of this imaginative technology that we're seeing coming to market. So that's ICE. And I'm just going to finish the technology bit with a sort of slight word of caution, which is very difficult in a place like Stanford. I've just been to the D School and heard wonderful things about don't be constrained, you know, unleash your potential. And that is absolutely fantastic. But I'll just tell you what the reality of my world is that I'm battling with. On the one hand, technology is becoming more innovative, more awesome, more simple and easy to use, and think 3D printing and Google Glass or whatever you want. But on the other hand, our clients are actually starting to demand the exact opposite. They want it regulated, they want it locked down, they want it so it can be audited. And again, I've just been on a cybersecurity 2-day summit, and of course, here that Goldman Sachs have 20,000 attacks on their network a day. And this is why, when they're dealing with their supply chain, they want to make sure that supply chain is secure as they are. So this is what I call the technology contradiction, and striking that balance through the, if you like, the complex maze to keep all sides happy, take advantage of great new technology, but on the other hand, keep the clients happy. I'd like to say I have the magic answer, and if I have, I'm not sure I'll tell anybody. Yeah, it's not an easy one. So it's just something to bear in mind. So I'm sort of coming to the end. And so taking all these factors on board, all this innovation, the technology, what's happening in the legal services industry in the UK, what might a traditional law firm of the future look like? And before I get into that, it's worth mentioning this law firm. Again, is everyone familiar with Axiom? I mean, Axiom are probably the most significant, if you like, disruptor coming into the industry. 1,000 lawyers in the US, Europe, and Asia, and they are cited in nearly all surveys as being the biggest threat, if you like, to the sort of traditional model. And as you can see, they very much pitch themselves that traditional law firm pays its lawyers, we pay our lawyers, but then a traditional law firm comes with all this extra baggage as well. And then, using their own slides, as you can see, they look at, if you like, the pyramid of work that's being done in the legal sector and by a law firm and say, well, there's this big bit at the bottom, which is low risk and high volume that, yeah, pretty much anybody can do. Then you've got this bit in the middle that might need some business experience, where your in-house counsel is really the people that should be doing that. And then you've got the bet the ranch stuff, that is where you go for big law, who've got the real deep experts. But of course, in reality, this pyramid of work is being done by traditional law firms, the whole lot. And what Axiom are doing, and of course some of these other ones I mentioned, like Riverview Law and Keystone Law, they're coming in at the bottom. And that's where they're seeing the proposition initially. But of course, they're not going to stay there. Like all disruptors, they're going to come up. And so the question is, what are the sort of law firms going to do? So this is where my Bill Gates quote comes in. That was pretty much the legal landscape 10 years ago. That was the choice of a client. You went in-house or you went external. So you can see in 10 years a lot has happened. You can imagine in 2003, if you thought 2 years ahead, not a lot took place. And that's that overstating perhaps the 2 years and understating the 10 years. And if we now look at how things are today, that's pretty much what it looks like. A client has a choice of many different types of services it can take, and a choice of many different people who can actually deliver that service. And I think I've touched on a lot of those. And so the question is, for a traditional law firm, is, what are we going to do? Some may just focus on quality. Some may focus on the volume work. Some may decide they're going to be niche and boutique, or retreat to the high ground. And of course, some inevitably may fail. But there is one other sort of alternative, and that's perhaps to become a single trusted advisor for all those services. And use your brand in the same way that perhaps some of the big four accountancy firms do, to actually deliver high-quality services that compete with all those other players in the market, but to provide an entire end-to-end service to your clients. So that's just a possible future. So, in summary, again, going back to my Bill Gates quote, it's only a few years since the economic downturn. So from all those things I've talked about, am I seeing sweeping changes? Am I seeing radical and fundamental differences in what's going on? From the outside, not really. It's only when you start digging underneath the surface that you see that transformation is taking place. And people predicting in 2 or 3 years that things are going to be fundamentally different are probably going to be a bit wide of the mark. But perhaps when we think about 2023 and look backwards, and if you invite me back, I may show some slides there of what the law firm of 2013 looked like. But I think it's a time to be very optimistic. Actually, the demand for legal service is not diminishing. It is just that the way they're being delivered and the roles that will be required in the future, whether these are legal project managers or legal engineers or legal process optimizers, these will be much more numerous. And it could be that actually law attracts many people into the legal sector who never thought they would want a career because they just didn't want that, perhaps, traditional model. And so I think it is a time to be positive. Growth is going up, and I think the next 10 years will be a good journey. So thank you for listening.
Questions for Gareth? Okay, I'm going to pass this around, so we'll start with you, Ron, and then behind you. You'll pass it on.
I don't want a difficult one, Ron.
You mentioned document automation as disruptive, and yet document automation in-house has been increased use and is supporting law firm models in many ways. So is it just client-facing? That's the disruption, or in what ways is it disrupting, and in what ways is it helping?
Well, I think the way we use it, so the question was around document automation. Is it disrupting or helping? I think the answer is it's both. So I think where it's used in an internal context, it's improving. You're not able to do things quicker, especially with people who are less trained. You're obviously able to provide a level of consistency. And when you're talking about, for instance, our credit agreement, which is 300 pages long, you can save a significant amount of time. But don't get me wrong, actually building all the content that goes into that document automation tool for a 300-page credit agreement takes a lot of time and effort. But I think that's where it's going to improve things, where if you want to start having trainees or junior lawyers producing documents of a consistent and the same quality, document automation has got to be the way to go. As I said, the further an associate goes in their journey, the more they're likely to think, I've got one here that I did last week that I'm sure I can do a save as on. But I definitely think it's disruptive in the external market because you can now start to deliver solutions and services direct to the client and the consumer. And I mentioned the example, Exari, which I was quite impressed with. I did think it was going to be sort of wills and conveyancing and very consumer-driven. I'm very surprised when I saw they did things like is the master agreements. So, which is around the derivatives market.
Hi, yeah, I had a question. For the ABS, how are investors treated for purposes of conflict of interest? Like clients or?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, so I understand that sometimes you can have an investor in an alternative business structure.
Yep.
So how is that treated for purposes of conflict of interest?
I won't say I'm an expert in that. But in terms of a private equity house, the same rules would apply, that you wouldn't be able to use your own law firm to potentially to act on your behalf unless you instructed them to do so. But I must admit, that's one perhaps I'll need to take away and come back to you. I said I'm not a lawyer on that one, so that's probably where my knowledge stretches a bit. But I'm happy to take that question if you like and come back to you if I can get your email address. Yeah?
So I'm really interested in how kind of the knowledge or the mindset spread. Do the law firms get together and talk about this explicitly? How do you think, are these kind of discussions contagious? Are they happening explicitly? What's the kind of state of conversation?
I think the state of conversation is very high. I think one thing that's really interesting, as I said, on the outside, it doesn't look like things are that different. And actually, if a few years ago you went into a law firm and started talking about legal process management, business optimization, and the impact of technology, they would just dismiss you out of hand and say, don't bother me with that stuff. And now it's pretty much the hot topic on every conference, every seminar, every offsite, and all the legal journals are full of it. And certainly with my own colleagues, and Ron attended one of the biggest sort of organizations, certainly in North America, for sort of legal technology and support functions in the summer. But it does depend on who you talk to. Again, there are plenty of people dismiss it out of hand, but there's plenty of people now. You've got that growing minority, if you like, that are sort of building up some momentum. And even when you get to partner level, there are so many more partners who are open to discussing, you know, how can they make things more efficient? How can they look at their processes? How could we look to sort of gain an advantage in this area? Whereas I said, just a few years ago, that was almost a non-existent conversation. So I'd say a lot of talk happens. And I've got a London event that I'm co-chairing next week of this organization, which is called ILTA, the International Legal Technology Association. And we've got a whole track on technology innovation, and we've got a number of people like IBM there and others to start talking about that.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll make a comment and then ask a question. My comment in regard to what you guys said is that I've been asked to be on a panel. I won't identify the association because it's not necessarily a positive view of them, but it's an international association of lawyers central in summer, and a panel that's essentially dealing with the issues that you've been discussing. And I said, well, essentially somebody like you on this panel. And I was told that would be very boring. It's not specific to you, but that the lawyers, I mean, this is, you know, the lawyers in the room would actually rather hear from lawyers. And I said, well, that's sort of part of the problem that the panel was all about. That was the comment. The question is, Allen and Overy is an international law firm. You are in, you know, various parts of the world, and so I'm curious as to whether you have any observations about how much of the developments you're describing is is now moving outside the UK, the US, where we have analogous things, although we don't have the change in the regulatory structure. Do you see this elsewhere in Western Europe? Is your Netherlands office using the same kinds of technology? What about other parts of the world, etc.?
Okay. Well, certainly now in Overy, we have a sort of one firm culture. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what lockstep is, for instance. Okay, everyone's familiar with lockstep. Okay. And that pretty much drives the sort of collegiate mentality we have. So literally everyone works, for better or for worse, I should say, on the same systems. So if you log on in Vietnam and you log on in a Washington office or in a Sydney office, it's exactly the same systems. In terms of, if you like, the conversations, it's interesting because, of course, many of the pressures are coming more or started more in the Western world, if you like, in the US and Western Europe out of the economic downturn. What I mean by that is, you know, the sort of panel pitches, the sort of competition, and, if you like, the due process that clients are putting law firms through. And the further you went out, where you may go to Asia and it's more about relationships and who you know, those things weren't so prevalent just a few years ago. But it's interesting, it's even changing there as well. And certainly now we find in Hong Kong, you know, lowest cost wins, you know, and that's it. End of story almost. So I would say from the sort of systems perspective, we always attempt to eventually roll everything out to everybody. But of course, what you do is you start at a small center, get some evangelists on board, also think of the logistics of maybe working through a problem or an opportunity. And then if it takes off, you start to sort of look to implement it on a wider scale, because the reality is if you try to go big bang, it'll fall down quite quickly because you'll find more people to start with want to say, no, I don't want to do that. So you sort of start to try and build momentum in the first instance and then sort of start to widen it out. And it's very true what we're doing with the ICE products. There's plenty of people saying, "Oh, I don't think much of that. You know, I'd rather use Word." And I always think there's three types of people: the people you've converted, the people that are waiting to be converted, and the people that you'll never convert. So there's no point even trying. So yeah.
Sure. Your point about lockstep was close to my question. So I was at Clifford Chance in their Paris office years ago and working as a support lawyer.
Okay.
And it was incredibly impressive how much the UK firms reinvested in their knowledge base. This is even back, this was 15 years ago. And some of what you see, what you present here, looks to me to be a little different than what's going on in most of the US firms, which are more or less an eat what you kill sort of a model.
Yeah.
Would you characterize that the London firms, London-based firms are different in some respect and perhaps ahead in some respects?
Well, they're certainly different. Most of them are lockstep, may have forms of lockstep. But what you're seeing, of course, now is these growth of this new category of international law firm from these mega mergers, and they're working on a sort of Swiss Verein system of different profit pools, which is in the first instance buying them scale almost immediately. Obviously, the trick then is how do you become larger than the sum of your parts if all you're doing is working off independent profit pools. So there's quite a few Swiss Vereins now being born out of those sort of mega mergers like Norton Rose Fulbright. But it is interesting because I was actually talking to Ron about this earlier because, as you said, most of the US firms are sort of eat what you kill model, which doesn't necessarily always go down that sort of spirit of collegiality. But on the other hand, it's a model that's very, very successful. And as I said, there's a big challenge in London and Europe at the moment as the US firms are starting to realize they need to become much more international. And they've got compensation models when you start looking at rainmakers that are very attractive. And that's a difficult one to defend against.
I was with McDermott, Will, and Emery, and they, of course, made a big splash when they came into London. This was 12 years ago or something like that because of compensation.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I was just talking with somebody in a law firm about a content model, and it was clear that they really viewed themselves as owning the content, even vis-a-vis an associate down the hall. And I think that that's quite different in the lockstep firms.
Yeah, most of our systems are knowledge systems, so we have a large knowledge base with secure standard form precedents that people can access, and that's shared all over the firm. So that knowledge sharing and that, if you like, partnering between partners is something that is a culture that our managing partner and senior partner are very keen to promote, and that's pretty similar amongst the rest of the sort of magic circle, the other big firms in London. So that is a difference, quite a key difference. And it's interesting to see now as we're getting more of this head-to-head sort of going on with the international law firms, which model is the right one? It's difficult to say. Hi.
Hi. I guess an observation on the profession. I think one of the in terms of that statement, I think maybe one of the issues that the law faces as a challenge is the fact that it's still seen, I don't know whether or not it's just the UK or outside of it, as a profession and not really still so much as a service or as a business, and it's got a sort of monolithic sort of resonance to it in terms of how it conducts business. Related to Axiom, and you've got the three different pyramids. So you've got the three different pyramids. You've got efficiency, experience, and exceptional. Do you think one of the problems is that it's very difficult to actually abstract out quality from experience in terms of organizational culture within law firms? And that if you're really going to have disruption in terms of how legal firms dispense advice, that you can basically just get more agility or in terms of recognition of quality of advice from seniority within a firm, and that you can actually get more exceptional, or the identification of exceptional advice, aside from who gives it to you?
Yeah, I think this whole point around quality is a really interesting one in the knowledge industry. Not least at the moment, of course, the quality is normally implied within the CV of the lawyer. You know, what are their experiences? What are the deals they've worked on? You know, where are the successes? And actually trying to measure that quality, especially in the lower level work, and putting those measures in place is what a number of firms and LPOs are looking to do, to build in those sort of quality sort of metrics into the work that's being delivered. But yeah, in terms of selling the sort of high-end work, it's very much on your, you know, experiences. What's the wealth of the depth of the organization you have, because most of our clients are working in a sort of global context. So, you know, what's your multi-jurisdictional capabilities? And it's more around that sort of knowledge than being able to quantitate it. I'm not sure, have I understood your question correctly? I'm not.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, it's just great if you call the experience in the middle one, the experience or the identification.
Okay.
As blockage.
Yeah.
Because you can actually have exceptional work being done by someone who's not necessarily experienced.
Okay.
So even with Axiom themselves, who are seen as disruption,
Yeah.
you know, if they actually have experience as the middle triangle, that will still be enough for them in terms of actually delivering optimal work, in terms of optimizing the time and the cost.
Yes.
So it's abstracting quality from experience.
Yeah. Yes, and you're right, and where I understand now, so in an industry where you've got that maturity level, you get that extraction, whereas where you go into perhaps a less mature organization, it's who's been there 10 years and happens to know everything, and therefore you just associate the quality. No, I agree entirely. And that's a very important point, especially when you go into outsourcing, because on the one hand, you want to move a whole load of work to somewhere else and have it done in a qualitative way, but you also need to have some people left who are intelligent customers as well to actually understand what's important to your business. But no, I take your point entirely that there can be this sort of, well, you've been around years, so therefore that's quality, but it's not, it's just experience.
Everybody, thank you so much. Gareth, thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.